Ruth was unfortunately booked out for today's debate, so we decided to move it downstairs. And where better to discuss mandatory detention and deportation than the airport lounge, where everyone's about to pack their bags. When the Monash Association of Debaters saw that we'd be debating against SA, we thought we'd be against some entirely irrelevant backwater hicks. And then it turned out SA didn't stand for South Australia. So we're going to make 3 arguments for why mandatory detention is in fact a humane option. The first is going to be that it is not necessarily structurally inhumane. There's no doubt that the way we do mandatory detention now is humane, but it need not be. There is nothing inherent in the way in which we need to detain people when they arrive in Australia that means that it needs to be inhumane. So, there are some things that we should not do that I learnt that we currently do this morning. The first one is we should probably not privatise our detention centres and give it to a corporation renowned for their inability to treat people humanely. Secondly, we should probably not locate our detention centres in the ocean or very near to the ocean or in countries not Australia. Thirdly, we should probably not force people within these detention centres to work. Fourthly, we shouldn't starve, beat, vilify or abuse people within those detention centres. And fifthly, we should probably not ignore their health problems and otherwise deal with issues they might have. Those are all things that we debatably currently do that we shouldn't, and I don't think it's very controversial to suggest that they're not in anyone's best interest. But there are some things that we should and that we can do to improve detention centres such that they are humane. The first one is shorten the period of detention. We could do this by a number of mechanisms. The first one is by having a bail process similar to that used in the United Kingdom. One other way we could do it would be to remove the notion that even once you are declared a refugee, if you don't fit within a particular country or particular section's quota, then you are still kept in detention even though you are a refugee. We'd remove that policy and say after 6 months, if you can't fit into a particular quota, we'd put you into a quota. So this does 2 things. This shortens the overall period of detention, but also provides certainty. So people know when they're going to be out of detention and they know when they're going to be able to move to the community. And we think that certainty is the type of certainty we afford all types of people that we currently imprison, and that is why we are able to mitigate the mental health concerns felt by them. The second thing we would do is fund services better. We would fund mental health care, education and employment training. All things that are done in countries like Malta, where the government administers effectively those programs. And in Portugal, where NGOs are allowed equal and transparent access to the people within it and are able to provide those services effectively to the people detained there. The other thing we would do is improve the accountability of our detention centres. We'd make the treatment and processing subject to judicial review. We'd give these people better access to counsel, and we would allow NGO scrutiny of those detention centres. So it's not enough just for SA to show that the way we currently do mandatory detention is bad, because no one is of the opinion that the way in which we currently handle mandatory detention is not particularly humane. The case will be from the Monash Association of Debaters is that it's not inherently humane, it's not structurally inhumane, and there are things that we can and should do and not do in order to ensure that humane treatment. The second argument I'm going to make is that it's more humane than the alternative. It's more humane than any alternative we could possibly provide. And there's no point in kind of considering humanity in its absolute vacuum sense. We have to consider whether or not a particular policy is humane compared to the viable alternatives. One alternative to detaining people would be to immediately deport them. My little antennae tell me that's probably not going to be the case of the negative side. The case probably will be some sort of really uber lefty, hug everyone, community processing type plan. Here's why that's a bad option. First reason. It decentralises the service provision. It means that refugees who need unique services in healthcare and integration and language training don't have access to it. And they'll be put into a community that is notoriously underfunded and under-resourced in those domains. We think it's problematic when most of the Australian community currently doesn't have access to effective mental health treatments, especially in rural areas and areas where the urban fringe is expanding. We don't think that that's the type of place we want new arrivals to Australia being forced to try and find access to those services. The second reason why we think community processing would be more inhumane is because of the problem of out of sight, out of mind destroys the accountability that currently exists. Once asylum seekers are in the community, the ability of their treatment to be assessed in the political process is even more limited than it currently is. We think onshore detention centres with full transparency for NGOs would be a far better way to ensure services were actually provided than allowing refugees onto the streets where their treatment or otherwise becomes a law and order question for right-wing people to bash and drum up opposition to their existence. We also think, thirdly, that it hurts integration of people within our community. We think there are significant barriers to integration, whether they be language or societal norms. We think most of these barriers are erected by mainstream Australia. Most of them are erected not by refugees. But the process of integration is a two-way street. We have to recognise the reality that there are challenges to integrating and trusting people within our community. And we need to ensure they are delivered the services, the techniques and the protection that they need in order to be able to effectively integrate. They need the real tools to be able to do that. The outcome of a process of community processing would be ghettoisation and the cyclical harms of stigmatisation that result from that type of policy. The third reason why community processing is less humane than mandatory detention is because it's important to disincentivise the journey to Australia. It is more inhumane not to have detention than it is to have the current detention program that we do. Why is that? The journey to Australia is particularly dangerous. The first reason is there is not a single UN camp between Baghdad and Bangkok, which means for a large proportion of your journey from a lot of the countries of origin, you exist outside of a legal, regulated framework, which means you are reliant upon people smugglers who exist outside of the law. You are reliant upon dangerous channels where you're likely to be exposed to exploitation, to criminal gangs, and to the types of indebted and indentured servitude that result from those types of processes. The most obvious reason that it is off-cited by people is it is a dangerous sea journey done by people who are underqualified and are likely to lie and misrepresent that journey that you make to Australia. There is no way to avoid that reality. And we think even once you make it to Indonesia, you face significant barriers and dangers in that last step coming to Australia. Not having mandatory detention would be a draw card to Australia. Here's why. Because to have community processing or to end mandatory detention would be perceived as a softening of an existing policy. You have to recognise in a dynamic in which we have had a policy of mandatory detention, to stop doing it would be interpreted and presented as a significant softening of that policy. That is magnified by a perception gap. You're never actually going to be able to communicate the reality of our treatment of refugees one way or another. The only thing you can hope to do is communicate that if you come by unauthorised channels, if you take those risks, if you make those journeys across the sea, you will be detained. It is a less desirable option, it is less preferable than going through other channels. And we think that we have to recognise that perception gap, and we have to recognise that the way in which people perceive that journey is defined by the messages we send. We need a clear message that says that it's not the channel that is preferable, that you will face detention, but that detention can still be humane because those types of messages are the ones that are communicated and the ones that get through. Because this isn't a paradigm not of a choice between staying in Afghanistan or coming to Australia. This is a choice between the range of different destination countries that exist for these asylum seekers and a range of different mechanisms that they choose to take. We're happy to say that a more humane policy pushes them towards the more humane options, and we think that mandatory detention can be humane, should be humane, and will be far more humane than anything they can present to you. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague's election pitch there. But the reality is that, in fact, we're actually not discussing the hypothetical mandatory detention policy that exists purely in his head with all of its humane aspects and its structural humanity. The thing that we are actually debating is the Australian Mandatory Detention Centre system. And in that sense, when debating the humanity of mandatory detention, you have to take all of the inhumanity and the barbarity and the brutality that occurs in the Australian detention camps right now and right here in this country. So those of you here, I might have read a report a couple of days back, just about a week ago actually, in the Age newspaper. It was a report released by Serco, the private corporation that runs Australia's mandatory detention centre system. And in it, the report details statistics that I think reveal the structural inhumanity that exists at the heart of these detention centres. And what it showed was that of the 8,000 or so refugees who at some point have either been through or still remain in Australia's mandatory detention centres so far this year, there have been 1,507 hospitalisations this year alone. There have been 72 psychiatric admissions this year alone. There have been 213 injuries from self-harm this year alone, and there have been 723 hunger strikes requiring hospitalisation in this year alone. And what that means is that in the 8.5 short months of 2011 thus far, all of these startling statistics have emerged from Australia's mandatory detention centres. And in fact, for the tens of thousands of refugees who have been through these centres since it was introduced by the Keating government in 1992, those numbers are, of course, much, much higher. And shamefully, since the Labor Party took office in 2007, there have been 7 refugees who have successfully committed suicide. Now, the reason I guess I've raised these statistics is because I think that actually, on their own, they're sufficient in bearing out one very important truth, and that is that there can be no other word to describe a system that produces these sorts of results, but inhumane. At its most basic level, the system of mandatory detention fundamentally denies those detained within it their human rights. Now, I'd like to thank, again, the first speaker from the affirmative for not defining the topic. I guess that gives us the chance to define it first and for them to answer it. Now, in reality, the way we're going to define mandatory detention is as a system in which all persons entering the country without a valid visa are mandatorily detained and therefore possibly subject to deportation. In reality, it's not a particularly difficult concept to define. Asylum seekers are people who have fled from war and from persecution. Mandatory detention is the system that locks them up. Now, I think it's pretty important to recognise in reply to all of the nonsense about the structural humanity that we heard from the first affirmative speaker, that in fact, it's the logical heart of mandatory detention that is inhumane. It's not just all of the other things like the racist guards. It's not just the fact that it's run by some private company. It's not just the fact that it's offshore. The things that are inhumane about mandatory detention are fundamental parts of mandatory detention. And so we see things like the enforced idleness, the lack of freedom, and the lack of any definitive limit to the detention. It is these aspects that mean that just a couple of days ago, the head of the Australian Doctors Association said that, quote, mandatory detention lessens the health status of the detainees currently inside of it. It's these aspects that meant that for Patrick McGorry, who was Australian of the Year in 2010, he called mandatory detention, quote, factories for producing mental illness. And it's these elements that meant that a nurse who was sacked just last week from Darwin Detention Centre for criticising the centre for the way it was run, criticised mandatory detention and said that it, quote, violently exacerbated the existing mental health issues in the refugee population. Now, the government claims that mandatory detention must exist for a range of reasons. Now, Sarah Garnham as second speakers and Omar Hassan as my third speaker are going to go through the series of them and rebuke each one of them individually. I think it's important to say, however, that the fact that such reasons are raised does not render the barbaric system of mandatory detention humane. In fact, these reasons only serve to conceal the real inhumanity that exists at the heart of the system. I personally had the gruelling experience just about 2 months ago of visiting Broadmeadows Detention Centre in Melbourne's west. Broadmeadows is one of those lovely, humane places that locks up exclusively children. Now, although I was only there for 3 hours, the only way in which I could describe the experience of being in Broadmeadows Detention Centre was as soul-destroying. One of the young boys that I spoke to lifted up his shirt, pulled up his sleeves and pointed to the scars, the self-inflicted scars that covered his shoulders, his arms and his wrists, and said 2 words, every day, which meant that every day he cut himself in that hellhole. And this is the reality of Australia's apparently humane mandatory detention centre system. Now, I think it says something about the fact that refugees, who as we all know are very brave and courageous people, who have been forced to flee from some of the most horrible, the most brutal repression and torture, from some of the most brutal dictatorships across the seas, only commit suicide or attempt to commit suicide when they reach Australia and are put in Australian camps. I think that says something very real and very true about the system of mandatory detention. Okay, but I want to also define a second word in the topic, which is a word that is quite important, and that is the word of humane. Now, I think humane is a word that is characterised by kindness, mercy or compassion, and it's marked by an emphasis on humanistic values. Now, importantly, being humane does not mean that something is necessarily just better than something else. It does not make Australia's mandatory detention centre system humane just because it wasn't as bad as a genocide that occurred somewhere in some foreign country. Actually, humane needs to be considered with reference to the refugees locked up inside mandatory detention. That is how the definition of humane will rise or fall, because it is those people, those innocent asylum seekers, who are affected most brutally by the system of mandatory detention. And I think, given the stats that we've just read out, it's pretty clear that the way in which these refugees locked up currently inside are treated is not characterised by kindness, mercy, or compassion. There is, however, one third term, which I think is very important here, and it's an implicit term in the topic. I think it's actually a bit of an elephant in the room, and that's the word of racism. Because in reality, mandatory detention is far closer to that word, racism, than it is to the other word, humane. And I think we therefore need to deal with it. Actually, I think the racism inherent in mandatory detention exists at a pretty basic level. In a predominantly white country with a long racist history, there exists a system which locks up thousands and thousands of exclusively non-white, mostly Arab, asylum seekers. There's actually a very good reason why the vastly larger numbers, 50,000 every year, of British and European tourists who've overstayed their visas are not hunted down, locked up, or deported. And that reason is racism. On her recent visit to Australia, the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, Navi Pillay, commented that when it came to mandatory detention, quote, there is a racial discriminatory element here in the inhumane treatment of people. Even Malcolm Fraser, the former Prime Minister of the Liberal Party, for Christ's sakes, described the racist culture in Australian immigration. Asked what would have been the reaction, he said, ask what would have been the reaction if a boatload of white farmers from Zimbabwe would have come, and there you'll have your answer as to whether it's racist or not. And so therefore, I think it's very important that we've established the fact that it's racist, the fact that it's brutal, and therefore the fact that it is structurally inhumane. Thank you.
Hi everyone. The opposition made a lot of really good points, and I want to go through them one by one and discuss each one. But what I'm going to get to in my substantive argumentation later is probably the most important issue in this debate. That's tough for you, yeah? The most important issue in this debate is the plight of white people, and I'm going to be addressing that more in my substantive. The first thing I want to look at is the conditions that were reported by both sides of this debate, right? The conditions in refugee detention facilities are unacceptable at the moment, and we completely agree with that. What we want to do is look to the causes of those and say, are the causes of the suffering of refugees the mandatory detention or the context within that? And we think it's the context. It's privatisation, which severs the link between government accountability, between what all of us think about their conditions, and the actual delivery of those conditions on the ground. Privatisation is an error that we can correct, right? It's not pie in the sky. We just own those things, which means that if politicians are directly connected to the suffering of refugees, they are much more likely to not allow it. Secondly, as rightly was pointed out, indefinite detention is cruel and inhumane, but we don't think detention needs to be inhumane, right? There's nothing about the process of finding out about whether a person came from a war-torn country and therefore deserves asylum. There's nothing about that that should take forever. We think that if we resource people appropriately and make this a priority, it can and should be something that is done much more quickly. Lastly is the idea that the conditions are awful because they're under-resourced. You can't get access to mental health facilities, things like that. So true. Again, it's nothing that is structurally about mandatory detention that means that you can't get access to a psychiatrist. They should. We should give much more money to asylum seeker access to those resources while we process them. But there's nothing about mandatory detention as a concept which means that we can't do that. We don't think that it's inherent. The only actual inherent point that was pointed to by the negative team was that you are locked up, right? Because they said, oh, people are idle. Whatever, give them things to do. There's lots of opportunities for education, for going out and doing things, right? It's the locked up part that we agree is inherent. It's in the word detention. So that leads me to the second thing. Is detention inhumane? We don't think so. We don't think it's inhumane because the reality of the situation is when people arrive without documents, we don't know anything about them. And it's true that we can infer a lot from their circumstances. You probably wouldn't get into an incredibly leaky vessel were you not in a dire situation. We can infer that, but in no way can we prove it. And I'm sorry, but it's not actually good enough to just assume something about people. And the reason for that is because more people want to live in this country than can. And it sticks, and we should take more. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be some kind of maximum number that Australia is going to take. So then within that, how do you decide? Within that, how do you allocate priority? We don't think that it's acceptable to just let people get here however they want and not process them. So the question is, how do we do it? How do we determine those in genuine need that we allocate these scarce resources to? Yeah. And we think there's a way to do it in a humane way in detention. We've told you that community processing is unacceptable because the limited resources that we have to be spent in a much more careful way and are better used in a centralised area. We think that detention is also crucially important to stemming the demand. If we were to say that asylum seekers either were not going to be processed at all, were let in, or would be processed in the community, so would be allowed to basically live as any other legal migrant until we could prove that they did or did not deserve to be asylum seekers, if we were to make that decision today, that would be the biggest recruitment boom, the biggest money-making boom for people smugglers. They could say to anyone, are you thinking of selling every single thing that you own and taking this perilous, potentially life-threatening journey? At the end of it, we can almost guarantee that you will live as an Australian. You will live in this community, you'll be able to have all of the benefits of that. That is a frightening, powerful tool to give those people smugglers. We don't want to do that. You can make detention humane, but keep detention, and that's an important thing to discourage people from coming here. Lastly, let's talk about the racism of mandatory detention. Because what we heard from the first speaker of the negative was, this is an inherently racist policy. Two responses to that. No, it's probably not actually inherently racist, and if it is, fucking fix that. It's actually not hard to say if there are individual officers working within DFAT who only choose to lock up black people, you should fire the hell out of those people and probably put them in prison. The reality is that people who are more likely to go into mandatory detention are those without documents. And yes, it's true. The vast majority of illegal people who overstay their visa are people from the UK, right? They're just tourists. Those people happen to have readily available documents, which mean we don't have to put them in any kind of detention facility to process them. It's not racism that their documents are more available and they didn't happen to come from a war-torn country. And to the extent that it is, my God, fix that. But that had nothing structurally to do with this, with the mandatory detention process. So I'm going to move now and be the bravest person in this debate and talk about what white people think, because they've been ignored in public policy for too long. But really, what does majority Australia think about asylum seekers? And it's not a pretty picture, right? They think of asylum seekers because of the way that our politicians are frankly morally abhorrent, and because of the way the media panders to lowest common denominator analysis. Because of politicians, because of the media, people think generally one of two things, depending on how charitable they are, about asylum seekers. The general public thinks that either they're not deserving, right? The phrase queue jumpers is lodged in everyone's brain, even though, as everyone knows, there's actually no bloody queue, right? But people think they're queue jumpers, people think they don't deserve it, people think they might not actually be legitimate asylum seekers. The second thing that a lot of Australians do believe about asylum seekers is that they're a threat. People believe, wholly incorrectly, that if you come from an Islamic country, you're more likely to be linked to Islamic terrorism. Everyone in this room knows that's not true, right? But sadly, the current affair watching Herald Sun reading public is much more likely to believe those two things about asylum seekers, right? That they are not deserving, or in the worst case, they are dangerous and a threat to Australia. So, what does a process of mandatory detention do? It sends a really powerful message within Australia saying that the government can vouch for these people, right? That we put these people behind a fence. We have looked at their bona fides. We have tested whether they are A, deserving of refugee status, and B, a threat to this country. And Australia, the government, can vouch for those people once they are in your community. That is an incredibly important message to send to butt-fuckingly racist Australians, yeah? It's incredibly important because they need to be placated, because years and years of amoral politics or immoral politics have led people to have a fear of asylum seekers. So whether we like it or not, we have to deal with that. We think it's incredibly important to say these groups of people do deserve asylum, that they're not queue jumpers, they are legitimately in need, and that they are not dangerous. We think that just shoving asylum seekers straight into the community with no processing is not going to alleviate those misconceptions about asylum seekers. So why? Why is making white people feel happy even important? Because they're people who vote in elections, who can give resources to do the exact things that we want to do, make these detention facilities better. If you want the money to get mental health care facilities to these groups of people, if you want to increase the amount of refugees that we take, if you want to make sure that those things happen not in a privatised way, but in a way that there's government oversight, you need the public to care and you need them to want to help this group of people. The best way to help get the Australian public on board, to get money, to get attention, to get goodwill towards the cause of asylum seekers, is to say we can vouch for these people. They are safe and they deserve to be here. The only way we can do that to any actual reasonable extent is to go through a process of humane mandatory detention. And that's why we propose.
Okay, well, I want to go back to defining why mandatory detention is humane, both here in Australia today and in the abstract, as the affirmative have tried to argue against. According to the Universal Charter of Human Rights, Article 9 says that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention or exile. Article 13 says everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. And according to Article 14, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So to detain someone who is seeking asylum, and as even the affirmative have noted, those that come by boat to Australia are doing that, is arbitrary detention and persecution. Now, I wanted to respond to the argument that mandatory detention could be somehow humane if it was simply administered better. Well, this isn't the case all around the world, where detention clearly is administered better than in Australia, where it's the only country that mandatory detention applies, and where the UN has made a special allowance for singling out Australia as having a particularly racist policy. So I wanted to read one statement from a refugee in Norway who was detained there. And Norway is obviously somewhere which is upheld as having a fairly liberal-minded policy and strategy towards refugees. He said, "I want to be free so I can continue my journey. If I can't, I want to return to occupied Palestine and be with my wife and children. I would prefer to return to that hell than to stay imprisoned in this holding centre." People being imprisoned, people not having the freedom to move around and freedom to access services and rights is tantamount to persecution, and this is what mandatory detention looks like, what detention looks like all across the world. Now, I want to deal with the argument that's come up quite firmly from the affirmative, that it's the racism of the people in Australia, the backwardness of people in Australia that actually has to be catered to and has to be taken into consideration in this debate. Well, I think this is quite an insulting sort of way to look at it. It is completely the wrong way around. The Red Cross did a survey recently where they actually surveyed people not in the way that the Nielsen poll does, not in the way that the government polls do, but actually asked the question, if someone came to your house seeking asylum from fleeing a war, would you put them up in your house, not just in your community? And 80% of people said that they would do that. I think it is abundantly clear that the racism that underpins mandatory detention comes from the government. Even Malcolm Fraser could admit this in an interview to Kerry O'Brien when he was asked do you think that the government has more of a racist culture than is in the broader population of Australia? He said, I believe so, yes. The whole idea of establishing detention centres in remote, harsh localities, that sort of idea came from the department. And I don't think, we don't have to look back to Malcolm Fraser to prove this. Julia Gillard, in her induction speech on becoming Prime Minister, got up there, and one of the first things she said that was political correctness is dead, that this needs to be swept away when discussing the national problem of boat people, and that people who are worried about the influx of refugees should not be worried about being called racist or intolerant, because she is basically giving them leeway to be that. And I think, just as a side note as well, the kind of elitism that's underpinned the affirmative's argument here is fairly misplaced. Actually, more age readers vote Liberal than readers of the Herald Sun. So I think people shouldn't be too quick to condemn certain groups of the population rather than others. But I want to go back to the fact that mandatory detention is a racist policy, and that this is actually the biggest thing that makes it inhumane. I think, like the White Australia policy and like the Stolen Generations, this is a policy which will be looked back upon with absolute shame. And like the White Australia policy and the Stolen Generations, mandatory detention was also brought into being by the inglorious Australian Labor Party. And all of these things were justified as progressive at the time, in the interests of the people to which they applied and affected, but also in the interests of the wider community and so on. And whiter community, which of course we have to consider. So Paul Keating brought in mandatory detention in 1992, and at the time his immigration minister Jerry Hand gave 3 reasons for it. That it would stop, that it would prevent de facto migration, that it would facilitate the processing of refugee claims, and that it would save the cost of locating people in the community. So even back in the days of Keating, when mandatory detention was established in Australia, it didn't have a lot to do with being humane, and it still doesn't. The processing times for refugees actually became longer under Keating's policy of mandatory detention, and in 1994 he actually removed the limit on the amount of days, 273 days, which you could spend in detention, which paved the way obviously for indefinite detention. And today in Australia, the longest serving sentence which someone has served within one of these detention centres is 7 years. So mandatory detention has never existed in Australia in accordance with human rights, and it never will. And I think it won't even be made a little bit better. I mean, Labor, when they came into office in 2007, came in saying that they would get children out of detention and that they would reduce processing times. But actually there are much more children in detention now than when they took office, and there are over 600 on Christmas Island alone. Chris Bowen said about this, "We don't want children getting on boats to come to Australia thinking or knowing there is some sort of exemption in place." And today, the government, despite its own guidelines that it will try to get people out of detention in the shortest practicable time, the processing times are actually longer than they've ever been. So people in Darwin Detention Centre are waiting up to 18 months to hear their claims. Now, my positive solution for this problem, so-called, is community, people being given lives, houses, social security, access to free education, free healthcare, access to employment, and access to mental health services, trauma treatment, and all of those sort of things within the community. And it's not as if this requires a whole lot of new infrastructure, which is one of the arguments. Certainly not more than the $125,000 which is spent every single day on every single inmate within the detention centres every year. 90,000 people, refugees, are settled across the world every year, and this happens, quite happily. But not only, I think, should refugees be given all of these necessities, and I think to point to there being obstacles in terms of, well, other people don't receive these necessities is, fine, but totally irrelevant, because we would also like everyone else to be able to access these amenities and services. But I think that as well as that, it's important to state that people should not spend any amount of time, however long it is, within detention. That the idea that these people need to be processed because they don't have the proper documents actually is just racist. There are 50,000 illegal people, British and other tourists from other nationalities in Australia right now, and these people are not subjected to rigorous health and security checks. I think it's clear that underpinning the security and health concerns about people that come by boat from places like Afghanistan and Sri Lanka is an extremely racist kind of mythology. And so I think that, in conclusion, the White Australia policy, the stolen generations and mandatory detention, they all are marks on Australia's history. They all represent extremely racist and violent episodes. And I think there's no solution other than to be for obliterating mandatory detention altogether.
Well, who knew, ladies and gentlemen, who knew that democracy in Australia was in such disarray that all of us in this room actually really agree with the Socialist Alternative that mandatory detention is bad, and it is only the elected government that wants to continue this policy. Like, what a farce that argument was. It's unfortunate for SA that there are real people who legitimately believe in mandatory detention. So you can't just get up and say that everything Amit said was farcical as a result of the government being the only one that supports this. That's just not true, right? And if it were, maybe we could all go out and vote on this issue. Obviously, they need to look at who they're recruiting and how much work they're doing in the election, right? But secondly, it's not good enough in this debate to get up and say, we're never going to make this system better, so we should just abolish it. Suspend disbelief for a second with me, and let's have a think about whether or not, if they argue we can never make it better, we're ever going to be able to abolish it, right? Because according to them, we can never reform it. All right, well, that same government probably isn't going to abolish it, right? So where should we spend our time? Should we spend our time trying to convince people to abolish the system altogether? Or should we spend our time on something we could actually achieve? Like, for example, getting rid of the inhumane parts of mandatory detention. We say we should spend our time doing something valuable, but obviously SA doesn't agree with that. So, let's ask two questions at the end of this debate. I'm going to ask, first of all, whether or not there is any inherent inhumanity in mandatory detention. I'm secondly going to ask whether or not there is an alternative, and we think it was pressing that Sarah spent about 1 minute analysing community processing when we've done a lot of work to tell you about why it's actually not that successful. So, the way they wanted to characterise inhumanity in this debate, and Sarah just then told us that the Charter of Human Rights says two things. It says, A, you shouldn't be detained arbitrarily. The word arbitrary means without reason. The reason we detain people is because they don't have sufficient documentation. These people aren't arbitrarily found in the street. Like, I'm sorry, Sarah, we don't go out and find Muslim people and arbitrarily put them in detention centres. We take people off boats who have insufficient documentation and put them in detention centres. So yes, good. You can point to the Human Rights Commission. I can tell you what arbitrary means. We're all very smart in this debate. But secondly, she said we all have the right to seek asylum. True that, right? And we're allowing people to seek asylum. That's why we ultimately give people refugee status when they meet the criteria for being an actual refugee, right? So the two things she could point you to were entirely insufficient in this debate. But let's deal with what she said on beyond that, right? She said Australia's the worst, right? The UN calls out Australia on our mandatory detention all the time. And she also acknowledged in saying that we don't often hear from the UN about the mandatory detention policies of a whole host of other countries. The reason for that is because, in actual fact, there are plenty of places that operate mandatory detention in a favourable and good way, right? We gave you plenty of examples where mandatory detention operates okay, and that's why you don't hear the UN every single day criticising every single country except for Australia. We think that all points to one important fact in this debate, which is that the things that they have pointed to, honestly, people, we agree with them. People committing suicide as a result of mandatory detention is bad. No one supports that in this debate, funnily enough, right? We're not stupid on this side. But we say those things can be reformed. Those things aren't inherent in detaining people. And to the extent, right, that there are problems, we think you're more capable of solving them when you have a centralised process to actually administer those services and to make sure people do get the healthcare they need, right? The one structural part is that you detain people. The one structural part is that you keep people inside a set of walls and you do not allow them free access to the community. We were willing to acknowledge that, but we never heard from them why that very thing is inhumane, aside from when we heard from Declan that idleness is bad, right? And idleness leads to all these problems. We told you, you can fix idleness by educating these people in detention centres. You can actually do a whole host of these things. You can do it better if people are detained. But finally, on humanity, just for a second, right? We say on our side of the house that not every single person deserves refugee status, and I presume they're going to agree with that. And whilst it's a small number of people who try and cheat the system, we think there are people who try and cheat the system. We think the most humane solution is to not have those people filling up the quotas and taking up the finite resources. We think one of the best ways to make sure that nobody undeserving gets those spots and gets that money is through mandatory detention. We think ultimately the humane part of this is letting people into Australia and making sure they get sufficient resources when they're here, if they need it. They haven't told us how we're going to do that any other way, so we think that's a really problematic part of their case. But let's ask beyond that, whether or not there's a more humane alternative. Because obviously they've supported community processing. First of all, they didn't deal with a host of analysis we provided you about why community processing is actually incredibly difficult to operate and is actually quite problematic. So let's refresh your memories in case you weren't listening to Chris. First of all, we said that it is incredibly difficult to administer resources appropriately and services and all of the other things that they acknowledged and we agreed were good, like education and so on and so forth, when people are disparate and in the community and it is incredibly hard to find them. But even presuming you could, right? Unless they're proposing now that the racist government is going to give over infinite amount of money to this policy, we say with the limited amount of money we have, we should use it on centralised services so we can improve the quality of those services. Because it's incredibly expensive to create little centres that have all of these services available all over the country in disparate rural areas or wherever else they plan to send people to. We said that ultimately that was the best use of resources there. But secondly, they didn't deal with all that material about ghettoisation of people and about how, in actual fact, the biggest problem, and especially in Australia where we've privatised the system, is we've cut off direct accountability between the government and what actually occurs with refugees. That's exactly what community processing does, but it does it even worse. Because now it's incredibly hard to find out if things aren't being administered properly because we don't have anywhere to look. Now it's incredibly hard for governments to be held responsible for the lives and the plights of every single individual person when they don't get access to appropriate services. We told you that was an inherent problem in community processing. We think that is a problem for them. But finally, we told you that this makes people feel more comfortable with the refugees that do get let in. I would love it if everyone in Australia were as equally not racist as the Socialist Alternative. I'd be really happy with that, right? But that's not the reality. And I don't care if they're Herald Sun readers or they're Age readers or they're Liberal voters or they're not, right? Because none of that matters. The reality is there are a large number of people in the community who are racist. There are a large number of the people in the community who aren't even full-blown racist, but who are a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of a huge number of people coming into Australia with no documents, without any history that we can point to. It is not good that we agree with those people. No, madam. It's not good that we agree with those people and we don't agree with those people, right? But to the extent that we can placate those people and make the lives of refugees better in the long run, we say we should do it. Ultimately, if the outcome of mandatory detention is that when refugees go into the community to live their lives, people don't harass them. If that's the best thing you can point to, that's good for us. We say, if people stay away from them, if people believe they deserve those positions, so we're willing to vote in governments that say we should give them more services, those things are good. It's not good enough to close your eyes in this debate and pretend like people don't have these opinions. It's not good enough to close your eyes and pretend like there are no racists and that everyone agrees people should be let out into the community but for the Labor and Liberal governments, right? That isn't true. That is a lie from Socialist Alternative. At the end of this debate, we all acknowledge, right, that the way mandatory detention operates in Australia right now is unideal and probably inhumane. We gave you a real path to fixing that. They gave you words and ignorance. We're happy to propose.
It's great to know that John Howard is still alive in Australia today. Thanks, John. No, seriously. In all seriousness, it's good to see Gemma back. The last time we locked horns was in 2009 when I was an office bearer Unfortunately, she couldn't hack it and resigned after 6 months. Okay, the affirmative side, I think, have raised a lot of red herrings, which I think I want to brush off quickly. Firstly, this argument that we need to shorten times, the privatisation's been a real issue. Actually, they're not privatised, they're subcontracted. There's a difference, as many of you are law students, I thought you'd know that. The idea that providing more services is possible in detention and is somehow more efficient. Kevin Rudd, what's his name? Paul Keating, actually, one of his arguments for mandatory detention was that you could centralise services. This is one of his arguments. In actual fact, there is much, much, much more spent on refugees today, in imprisoning refugees today, than there would be on providing all the social services they need. $125,000 per refugee per year in this country. Now, obviously, I would not want to stoop to these kind of crude economic arguments for why refugees should not be in prison, but that is certainly one of them. I think the key argument, though, that the opposition have made, the affirmative side have made, I should say, is that mandatory detention could be more humane. And I think, really, this is just false, because the whole structural reason for mandatory detention, they said it themselves. I think the second speaker said we need to send a strong message. I think we've heard this before. Chris Bowen, John Howard, all these people. We need to send a strong message to the people smugglers and to refugees that they will not have a happy welcome here. And I think there's a contradiction in that, between saying that on one hand and saying process people in paradise. Can people see the contradiction? If you come to Australia and you're treated well, it's not going to deter anyone. If you think that it should, it will fail. So that argument is actually logically inconsistent. The fact is, mandatory detention is nothing to do with humanity, it's totally to do with deterrence. And that's the argument that we have made today. There is a reason why Australia is the only country in the world, despite what they may have said, that has mandatory detention. Other countries have detention. And I think Sarah has compellingly shown, and there are other facts that people want to know, that detention is always destructive, and always a restriction of freedom, and always a curtailment of human rights. But Australia is the only country that has mandatory detention, because Australia is the country that has sunk the lowest when it comes to the racism and the fear-mongering, and that is why Australia is the target of the UN, which is no defender of human rights in all situations. So, the reality is in Australia today that refugees are currently, on average, imprisoned for 299 days. Every refugee. There is no possibility that this is necessary. There is no possibility. This is the detention system in mandatory detention in Australia today. They talk about people smugglers. This is such a boring and tired argument, but I think it's worth talking about who these people smugglers actually are. The Age reported on 3 of them. 15-year-old Osi Lani and 16-year-olds Ako Lani and John Ndolu. I apologise for my pronunciation. 15 years old and 16 years old. They were apprehended near Ashmore Reef and transferred to a maximum security prison for adults. They were imprisoned for 15 months before the report eventually granted them bail because they were minors. Now, these are people smugglers. They're children who leave home to make a buck because they're trying to help people who flee. Other prominent people smugglers in history. Oscar Schindler. We've all seen that film. Well, he was actually a people smuggler too. And he made plenty of money out of that business. Would anyone argue that what he did in saving Jews from the Holocaust was a bad thing? I hope not. So, and the other argument raised by the affirmative is that somehow sending a strong message is actually more humane to the refugees because they won't risk the journey across. But is it really safer to stay home in Afghanistan? Is it really safer to stay home in Iraq, in Iran, in Sri Lanka, or in Syria, which is where the Australian government has been sending people? Syria, a country which our government has been so quick to attack and condemn for their human rights breaches, when we're doing just as many, or many here in Australia too. So actually, deterrence, saving refugees from the journey across to Australia is not more humane. For the refugees themselves, for future refugees, for anyone. It is inhumane. And that's why our side of the argument is correct, I think. But finally, protecting the community. this argument, we need to protect the whiter community, this racism. I think it's pretty clear the refugee issue was pretty much dead and buried in about 2007, 2008. And then what happened in 2009 was Tony Abbott realised, great, a wedge issue. I can re-raise the refugee issue. Everybody hates me on industrial relations. I'm totally isolated on gender politics and all that kind of stuff. What's an issue that I can gain some popularity? Tony Abbott re-raised the refugee debate, and the problem is that the Australian Labor Party is spineless and do not stand up and say refugees should be free, they have the right to seek asylum in this country. So racism was driven from the media and from the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. It has not been driven from below. No one in this side of the debate said all Australians support refugees. Our contention was merely the middle class, elitist, posh, thumbing your nose at the working class people of this country is rubbish. The point of the Herald Sun readers voting Labor is that voting Labor is some indication that you're less racist than voting Liberal. Okay. Now, to conclude, I think it's pretty clear that Socialist Alternative has won this little contest. That refugees clearly deserve to be treated better. The mandatory detention is no humane solution to what is really a non-problem. Refugees are not problems, they are people. But I guess I want to argue now that what is important to Socialist Alternative is not simply winning debates on campus against right-wing people, making right-wing debates. What is important to Socialist Alternative is achieving radical social change. And I think, actually, freeing refugees will require radical social change because none of the major parties of the establishment have anything humane to offer on this question. Obviously, the Liberal Party are filth. I'm not going to deal with them at all. But I think the Labor Party, it's worth remembering, they are the party of mandatory detention. They introduced it, they've toughened it, and under Gillard's watch, they've made it worse than ever. Last year, or maybe a year and a half ago, Kevin Rudd promised there will be no children out of detention. There are now more than there have been since when Labor took office. And actually, on an interview, contradicting this, one of the secretaries of the department said, there are no more children in detention camps. They're now in transit centres, motels, and so on. So all they've done is actually rebrand the detention camps, and that's a problem solved according to the Labor Party. So there's no solution there. The other option, I guess, is the legal system. I mean, there's currently a High Court challenge underway opposing the Malaysia solution as illegal. But I think it has to be said the legal system is no friend of refugee advocates or radicals in this country. I mean, in 2004, the High Court ruled that it was legal to indefinitely detain refugees with no state forever. This is Australian law. It's called the Alcatab versus Godwin case. This is Australian law. So the legal system is no ally of refugee advocates. I think what we need to do is build a grassroots movement, and that's why I'm encouraged that the Monash Refugee Action Collective is there, which I'm not a part of, but please speak to them, speak to Socialist Alternative afterwards, because this campaign, this issue is very live and very much heading in the wrong direction. What we need is a grassroots movement. 4 years ago, under John Howard, I'm going to wrap up. 4 years ago, under John Howard, public opinion was actually transformed. In 2007, 64% or 61% of people said they supported refugees, up from 31% in 2001. A 30% change, which means we can do it once, we can do it again. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Could we have another round of applause for all our speakers? So before you all disappear, there are a couple of people who just wanted to talk to you. Firstly, the Monash Association of Debaters president, and then someone from Refugee Action, I believe. Monash Refugee Action. So I'll just invite them to the stage. Thank you all for coming.
Hi guys, I thank you all for coming to the debate today. If you would like to get involved in debating a little bit more, we have membership forms, attendance forms here if you want to sign up. Tonight at 5 p.m. in the law basement, we have our regular training where we go through the different ways you debate how to make logical arguments, and how to be as good as these guys, and even when you're arguing something you may not necessarily believe in. So yeah, please come along tonight, 5 p.m. in the law basement. You can sign up there. We really encourage you to do it, so thank you.
Hi, I'm from the Monash Refugee Action Collective. Tomorrow we're having a forum here at the university where we're hosting a refugee named Ahmad. He's a Kurdish refugee who fled here under the Howard era. And I'm sure he will have some very interesting stories to tell and shed some light on the conditions within Australia's mandatory detention system, as the debaters talked to you about today. And it's also featuring a long-time refugee activist, Nicole Mousley, and I'm sure that both of them together will be able to tell us more about the inhumane policy of mandatory detention here in Australia. I also just wanted to tell you about another action that's happening on September 16th. It's a Serco protest and picket. Serco are the private corporation that build and run the detention centres. They treat refugees absolutely brutally, and we need to make a stand against them. So please, if you have any questions or if you want to find out more, we have a stall set up just over there. Please come and talk to us. Just again, that forum tomorrow is happening in the Rotunda in R5 at 1 o'clock. Thank you.
That's fine.
Hell yeah. We got it working in the end.